Right. So hi everyone, welcome to the Tilden webinar on acing the GMAT 775 plus. So the two people you see here are Mevit Matthew and Prerit Goel. They have been Tilden alumni for the 2024 cohort, and each of them have scored above 775, which is an obscene score if you think about it, right? So with that, what I would like to do is invite both of them. So what we're going to do today, guys, is we're going to be dividing the entire test prep process into two broad areas, right? One area where we will spend a lot of time is how did you go about like pre-test, right? Before the test where you got that score, how, like, what was your experience there, right? So right from the starting of your test prep till the test date, how did you really, go about planning, executing those plans, overcoming struggles, challenges, resources that you used, all of that stuff, right? So that's part one. And then part two, I think, which is oftentimes quite neglected in the entire test prep part, is how do you conduct yourself during the day of the test? How do you really position yourself to be in the peak form, right? It's almost like an athletes, right? How they do it, right? You want to make sure you go to the Olympics, you're really, really maxing out your performance at that pivotal moment, right? And that to me, I mean, based on I obviously took the older GMAT, I got a 99 there, but that is something that, we had a different webinar with two other folks, right? But to me, I feel is also a very, very important part of the entire test prep, which is unfortunately neglected a bit, right? Where that's why people are unable to uh, you know kind of really showcase their true potential in the test. Many a times people get nervous, this and that. So we will talk about that. So maybe what we can do is we can go alphabetical order, and we could start with Mevit first, and then we could go to Prerit. So my first question really is, tell me about the time you decided to start the GMAT, right? How many, like, how many months prior did you feel, or rather, what was your approach towards starting the GMAT in the sense, you know, the date, what resources you used, and all that, right? So if you could just encapsulate, some of that process at a high level, and then we can go deep.
Right. I knew I wanted to try out the MBA route. So GMAT was obviously, of course, I'm not saying you should take GMAT over GRE. I just took it because it was more specialized towards MBA. It made sense for me personally to go with GMAT. But then when I decided to do it, of course, I was in the final semester. I was going to begin my final semester. I think that's the point where everyone probably is at this meeting. So I was like, I'll take a look at the exam, figure out, what is the level of prep required, how much time I should really invest into it. And one thing I quickly realized based on the survey was that there's not a lot of hard prep that goes into it. Subject matter is very simple. It's just math and logic. You don't really need to study a whole lot of new things. So I figured, of course, I had other commitments during the semester. So I figured if I'm doing a little bit of prep over the weekends or whenever I get time between weekdays, then it should take about a month's prep time to be familiar with the exam, be comfortable with the formats, and then take it from there. So that's how I planned out. So I looked at the syllabus, looked at what kind of questions come, and then, kind of matched with how much I thought was necessary for preparation.
And for me, I know I wanted to do an MBA, so I was planning to give CAT as well. And in so, a lot of the syllabus actually transfers from CAT to GMAT. And so I decided to give both around October. And in so, I did prepare for CAT, but I started my actual GMAT preparation from this February only, like previous year, February. And so the total time for preparation took around only 1 month, I would say, because a lot of my preparation was done from CAT as well. But so I just decided to give the GMAT in March, and I knew that that was quite late. But I realized that I would have more flexibility because I started with deferred MBA quite late, and to juggle that with essays as well, it would be best if I did both. And so if I started with essays in Jan, then I could give the GMAT comfortably in March while simultaneously managing both.
Okay. So then let's start with, and maybe Prerit, we can start with you in this case, right? So When you're thinking about starting, I think one thing that a lot of people think about is how do you really plan things out, right? What was your strategy or what was your approach towards the GMAT? So here you are, like where day one, right? Where you just thought, yes, I want to take the GMAT. Yeah,
Yeah.
that we're talking about that time. So now standing at that point, how do you move forward? How did you decide what to do? What were your priorities? What were the steps? And how did you sort of approach the entire, how you are going to be working and preparing for it?
Right. So, as I mentioned before, so there's quite a few things to juggle with during the deferred MBA session. So, the first thing I wanted to do was establish a timeline for how long the preparation for GMAT would take for me. So, what I did initially was I just took and I also researched a bit on the exam and like when do you have to register for it and just the basic stuff. But from that and the first initial assessment that I took, I got an idea of where I currently stood and how much preparation it would need for me to be at a level where I would be comfortable with the score I get. And again, since I had a bit of preparation done already at the base level, I realized that I could be comfortable with 1 month of preparation. And so after that, I just broke down into how much time I wanted to allocate to GMAT each day so that I could comfortably juggle it with all the other stuff that was required for the applications.
I think the two things that I'm picking up from there, Prerit, one is you took an initial assessment. That's just to see, where you stood really, right? And then kind
Yeah.
of, and then based on that, right, you kind of decided, how did you go about deciding that once, okay, you got an X score in the assessment? Based
Mm.
on that, how did you sort of figure out this is the right time potentially for me to, apply or take the first attempt?
Right. So essentially, there are three sections in the GMAT, and once I took the initial assessment, I got a good idea of the quality and level of the questions. So, for example, I knew that I could handle the quantitative section completely well because like I come from an engineering background, and I knew that the level of maths questions that they were asking were pretty subpar and like within the level that we already did in JE, for instance. So that was easy. And then for the verbal and DI sections, I realized that I had amassed resources for it, like the amount of books and question banks that I would do to prepare for the GMAT. And so with the level of the score that I got, I realized that I'll have to complete most of these question banks. And then I divided the question banks into a comfortable amount. So for example, if there are, say, 100 questions in the bank, that I could do 10 questions per day. And based on that, I drew a rough timeline of how much time I gave to each section where I would get a potentially good score. So the MBA website actually gives a good assessment of where you stand and which sections are your weakest sections and stuff. And based on that, you can then check how much practice you would need.
Okay. Mevit, it's the same question for you. You're standing on day one of your GMAT, like, deciding, yes, I'll take the GMAT, right? What was your strategy or what was your approach toward the whole thing?
Right. First, of course, I began with the research, understanding how tough the exam would be, what is the exam about, what is the format, all of that, right? So, of course, online research, I talked to a few friends who had taken it, some seniors. We understood what the exam was and what is the level of expectation of the difficulty, right? And one thing that becomes apparent to you very early on, it's fundamentally not a very difficult exam. It might be a competitive exam, but like in
For
terms
you
of the
guys,
subject, no, I meant it in
it
comparison
can
to
vary
an
from
exam.
people to people. Yeah, I mean, that was just like, in jest, but yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
obviously there
yeah.
are things
No,
that are difficult and easy for different people. But yeah, please go on. Sorry.
yeah.
Yeah.
No, what I meant was it wasn't difficult in terms of the subject matter. So I realized early on that, it's more about how to tackle the exam, the format, the timing, whatever. So I think like Prerit also, once you register on the GMAT portal, you get the mock exam, two free mock exams, I think. So
Yeah.
I took the first mock exam and I got 700 plus, but I also realized, okay, this is the level of expectation, this is the timing, to get a feel for the exam. And even at that point, again, you have the textbooks, but the theory is nothing new. Like you said, it's subpar level at best. So there's nothing new you have to study, and that becomes quite clear when you take the first mock. If there are, of course, some topics you need to brush up on, sure, go ahead. But after that, you realize that it's about the time management. It's about making sure there are no silly mistakes, because even the way they give the questions, like, it's kind of dynamic, I believe. So if you get some early questions wrong with some stupid mistakes, then it'll really tank your score later on. So for me, it was just about figuring out how do I pace myself, how do I make sure I'm comfortable with the format of questions? So what I did after just the initial research and initial mock test is I realized that I want to do it in a time setting. I don't want to just do question banks questions because I don't think the level of difficulty is that high. So I bought the actual mock test. You can buy more optional mock tests from GMAT. So I did that, and I leveraged that to kind of understand my strategy or fix my timing, my when at which section should I focus more on, and etc.
So let's kind of deep dive into what you just said, right, Mevit? So
Yeah,
you talked about a strategy, right? What exactly,
yeah.
if you could elaborate on what was that strategy and how did what influenced that strategy? How did you go about, let's say, even setting a strategy in first place?
Right, right. To begin with, GMAT has been around for a long time. And there's a lot of people around the world who work on it. So if you go search online, of course, even on YouTube, you'll find different people talking about a lot of different perspectives on how to go about this and everything. I'm not saying you should follow them, but it gives you a baseline on how to think about it, how you should think about when to time everything, etc. And of course, how you do. And I believe time management and making sure you don't make mistakes are the primary important points for people probably in this meet, because you're all obviously from IIT or some similarly prestigious institution. The level of intellect, the level of talent, you guys got it. So it's just about being careful and being smart with the exam. So in terms of time preparation, I believe a lot of people do it differently. I've even heard of people making sure, for each question, they don't spend like too much, like keep it less than 1.5 minutes or whatever the time was for the specific. But I didn't used to do that. Again, it comes from practice. It comes from your own mock test. So what I did was each section I would divide it into three. So if it's for example, 21-minute section, like 21 to 14, 14 to 7, 7 to 0. So from 21, each section, I would have a plan for how many questions I want to cover. And it would be fairly consistent across the three sections. So if there were 20 questions, I wanted to cover the 10 questions in the first section, then next 6 or 7 questions in the next section, and make sure I have time to review and like ensure everything in the final section. And gives me a little bit of flexibility if I don't. So at each section end, like when 14 minutes mark hits or when the 7-minute mark hits, I would take a look at how many questions are finished. Should I speed up? Do I have time to be a little more careful with each question? And that's how I would recalibrate during the exam process. I wasn't concerned about how much time I'm spending for each specific question, because sometimes you spend a little bit of time on one question, the next question becomes very intuitive, you can quickly solve it. So I used to take a bigger sample size and split each division into three sections so that I knew where I was in terms of the time management. Think you're on mute.
Yeah, Prerit, do you want to maybe elaborate on your strategy, specifically like how Mevit talked about his?
So again, like Mevit said, accuracy and time management is more important in the exam than the difficulty of the questions per se. For me personally, I didn't even do what Mevit did with the 7 question partition. Like I didn't check the time at all for the most part in the initial stages, because just personally for me, just looking at the timer stressed me out. So what I did was I got an intuitive sense. What the sections allow you to do is they let you go back and change a few answers that you felt were wrong. So that was really crucial for me, because I got an intuitive sense of how much I should spend at each question. Although again, I didn't look at the timer. But another thing that the GMAT encourages is that you mark all answers. You don't leave out any answers. So what I just did, I didn't want to waste too much time on a question. I would just note that down and then I move forward once I thought I had a good enough guess, and I could spend more time on it later if I got enough time. Like they only let you change your answers if you have some time left in the section. And what I tried to do during the mocks prior to the exam day was I gave myself a lower time limit per section than the one they allot. Like if say you have 40 minutes for a section, I tried to complete each section in 35 so that I had some leeway. Of course, most of the time I wouldn't be able to finish in 35, but then that means that with the prep, even on the exam day, I had 2-3 minutes left on each section because I had prepared myself in such a way. So that was my strategy.
Okay, so just one thing that I kind of noticed, which is one thing which was in common with them is that they both had actually different strategies, right? So what it basically goes to say is that there is no one particular strategy that works for everyone, guys, right? Um, you heard right from Shubhan, Maitri, and myself, right? A lot of all of us had very different strategies in terms of how we appeared for the GMAT. One thing, if you guys are struggling with time, right? I would love to have our panelists discuss, at any point in their stage where where they're struggling, not really with the concepts, right? The concepts in like theoretically, right? If you had unlimited time on the test, right? Everybody would get a very high score, right? So if you think about it very critically, it is the time that differentiates, right, how people do in this particular test. So in that case, one of the most crucial skills becomes what do you do with the time that you have, right? Do you really spend, like Mevit said, right? He didn't really concentrate on the time per question. He rather looked at the sections and said, this is kind of a broad timeline that I have, right? Whereas Prerit, I think, got stressed, so he didn't really look at that at all, right? If you, for example, remember what Shubhan said, he basically looked at, time per question, and if he exceeded that, he would just let it go, right? And I was very similar to Shubhan's in that sense that I was horrible at time management initially. So I would never exceed, a couple of minutes or whatever the total time divided by the number of questions. That's the average. It's just below that is what I would take as the average, right? So, anyways, whatever you do, you basically have to ensure you have to recognize that your potential in the GMAT is determined by what do you do in that under that time pressure, and that is something that you already may be aware, but if not, I think that's a very crucial thing. If you internalize that, that is a crucial factor that really is going to make a difference between somebody who's getting a 695 versus somebody who's getting a 775. Truly speaking, right? It is that close. You can actually jump by 30, 40 points if you really manage your time well. That's something that I've seen firsthand, right? So going back to both our panelists, right? Did this time pressure, right? Initially in your stage when you're practicing, how did you internalize this entire time thing, right? Is there something consciously you did, or was it something that just happened naturally for you? And if you did it consciously, right, what were some of those tips and strategies that you could probably share with the audience?
I think for me, in terms of the time preparation, it just was sort of understanding how much time I would take because in quant and verbal or data insights is very different, right? For me, for quant was it's about slowing down. I was being too fast, and the questions weren't that difficult, so I would maybe make some mistakes along the way. But I had plenty of time to solve quant. So for me, they were just deliberately. So like I said, I took a lot of mocks, so I had that flexibility of really getting the time to understand where I was being too fast, where I was being too slow. So what I do is in quant, I slow down. In data insights is where I was initially not able to get every question correct on time. So what I did for that section is I took the time to really familiarize myself with the format because DI formats are a little bit different, right, from category. So yeah, I think in terms of time preparation, DI is where I spend the most of the time trying to practice questions, trying to be very familiar with, and there's very just a limited category of questions they ask anyway, right? GMAT really simplifies that problem for you. So you just make yourself familiar with those, and then the speed also picks up in my experience.
As for me, again, like Mevit, I also purchased the mock test series on the official website, and that helps you get enough practice to get a good idea of where each section you are struggling with and what are your strengths. So, for personally for me, quant and DI, I never really struggled with time, but for verbal, there were a few instances where I did, and for that, I tried to experiment around with how I handled the paragraph questions. So even in verbal, there are two types of questions, one being critical reasoning and then the other one being the passage ones. And for critical reasoning, you can't really improve your time much unless you build an intuition by practice. But for the paragraph ones, I tried a few different strategies that actually helped me out. So each strategy might not work for you. Like again, you can experiment around for yourself. But so I'll just help you list down all the strategies that I did try. So one was I read the paragraph entirely at the beginning, and then I thought of highlighting the parts where each question could be targeted and like reread them and something like that. And then I went to the questions. And personally, this strategy didn't work out too well for me because I felt it was too time consuming and you didn't really need to go through the entire paragraph at sometimes. So the next strategy that I tried was I skipped the paragraph entirely and I just went to straight to the questions. And I first got an idea of what they were asking, and then I went to the paragraph. And then I read, and I had a good idea of what the questions were asking already. And so I only targeted those areas for the most part, and this strategy worked out better for me. And then the third one was skimming the entire paragraph and then going to the questions and then rereading the entire passage, which might sound like it might take a lot of time, but actually that's better because then you have a good idea of both. Because once you go straight to the questions, you might not get a good idea entirely. So between me, these strategy two and strategy three were almost equally effective. And I think I did strategy three on the test day, but strategy one, I think is most common and that didn't personally work out for me. So I think you should try out different strategies for yourself to improve at verbal.
Yeah, and I completely agree. I mean, based on my experience as well as what I've heard from a lot of people who have scored high, during your prep, it's absolutely vital, guys, to make sure that you try out different things. You cannot start attacking. And they talked about, like, one of the sections here, but the same thing applies in quant, right? Potentially, there are certain topics that you're good at and certain topics that you may not be as good at, right? Some people may really be very weak in probability, for example, or they may be weak in maybe some other things, right? um, you know, so just know, like, how accurately you're scoring those oftentimes, and that can also dictate a strategy. And I'll talk to you about that, a little bit later. But let's move on, right, with you guys. So now we are talking about time management and specifically your own approach towards it. Now let's kind of go section by section. Is there something you want to share with the audience in terms of your best practices for solving quant? So, Prerit, let's start with you and then let's go to Matthew. Mevit.
Uh, So sorry, before I go to the section-wise analysis, I want to share one key insight about the GMAT as a whole.
Okay.
So in case that the people attending aren't aware, what it does is it sends the GMAT is an adaptive test. So the thing is the questions ramp up in difficulty as you get each question right. So what the test takers want is they want you to get a streak of good correct attempts basically. So what it does is it penalizes if you can't maintain a long streak. And if you do, so for example, if you get one wrong answer and that's in the middle of the test section, that's worse than getting it wrong at the end of the section. Because what they want is they want you to get a series of questions right in the like in a long streak basically. So that's really important in that sense is that you maintain the accuracy throughout because each wrong answer will also reduce the difficulty of the section and also at the same time penalize you quite heavily. So now going on to the section wise thing, one thing that I actually noticed, although it's very slightly noticeable, but again, as I said, since it's an adaptive test, if you get it wrong, the next questions will tend to be easier. And I picked up on that a few times where I could actually notice the question somehow felt easier. And then I specifically noted down the number of the question that I just did so that I could take a look at it once the section is over because I got a sense that that might be an incorrect answer. So that's one thing. And then otherwise, particularly for quant, personally for me, again, quant time management was never a problem, but I always tended to do I tended to solve questions both ways just because I had the time. One thing was I like took the question and then I got the answer like the normal way. But the other thing was I also just plugged in the responses to see if it would fit in the question or not. So for example, if they want you to calculate a variable's value, you can just plug and put and check if it satisfies it or not. So that's also another thing I did. So for example, it's like a two-factor authentication type thing, like double verification. But Yeah, so that's what I did. Besides that, if you just get enough practice, I don't think you will struggle with time management simply because if you have enough practice, the level of questions doesn't seem too hard. It's mostly about the accuracy.
Okay. Okay. All right. So let's go back to our questions then. I mean, unless Prerit, sorry, Mevit, you have anything to add to Prerit, we could probably go to the section wise, like just tips really, to kind of provide people an idea of how you approached each of the sections. So maybe let's start with quant, because both of you have been saying that obviously for you personally it wasn't much of a challenge. So we could maybe breeze through it and then maybe go to quant, to verbal and DI. Right, I've got a lot of feedback from the cohort about DI being sort of a bit tricky sometimes for some of them. So do you want to like maybe start with Q, V, and DI in that order? Is that okay? Yeah. All right.
Sure.
So maybe you can start with quant, and we can go from there. And then once Mevit's done with quant, maybe Prerit can chip in, and then Prerit, you can start with verbal, and like we can just go do a back and forth. That is.
Yeah, in terms of the quant, right? I think it actually ties up with what Perry was saying. The initial few questions are important. So if you miss the first few questions, I think it severely limits how much you can score in that section. It doesn't matter if after the 5 questions you get everything right. If the first 5 questions are wrong, you get very limited in terms of scoring ability. So for me, quant, like I said, it was about slowing down. So for the first few questions, I would really, double check, triple check, ensure that every other options are not, throwing me off anything, and really confirm that all the answers were correct in the first few questions. And I mean, I think it's a personal thing, but for me, that really after a few questions, I also get the momentum going, and then I don't think for most of the IIT folks here, quant will be a time constraint at all. So taking the time out for the first few questions and making sure you're not making any mistakes is very important. There's also an acronym around the community that usually used. I forgot what it is. Essentially, just make sure you're not missing out on some negative signs, zeros. Make sure they're asking for an integer or the answer format, right? So the best practice is just to look at the options. Even if you solve a very complicated thing, it's not like they'll give you complicated equations to solve, but whatever exercise you do and you find the answer, uh, just make sure you look at all the 5 options before picking whatever the option you think is right, because there might be a catch somewhere. Not frequently, but with how easy the quant section is, ideally you should target for getting every question correct. Like even if you get 2 or 3 questions wrong, I think if you're targeting for 100 percentile, it becomes a challenge. So be really. I mean, for me at least, I was very conscious about, very mechanical about making sure that the quant questions I was not making a mistake, which wasn't a big concern for me for the other 2 sections.
Yeah, to add on, like the worst that you can do in mocks is probably make silly mistakes simply because it's not that rigorous. So I would strongly advise that you reread each question twice and see if you missed out something, because it's pretty easy to make silly mistakes. To solve for the variable. Just read the question thoroughly and see if you missed out something. And see what they're asking for, because a lot of the not because even getting one question wrong in quant can be pretty significant. Simply because quant is supposed to be the highest scoring difficulty. Besides that, I agree with Mevit's thing that you should try to go slow and use up all of your time. Like not without like unlike DI and verbal, you would have pretty sufficient amount of time to tackle quant questions. So don't try to rush it, because then it becomes easier to make silly mistakes. Okay, I think that's it for quant. Should I move on to verbal?
Yes, I think Prerit, there may be
Yeah.
some issues in terms of the internet, because I think your video was getting a bit paused. I'm not sure if the other people also saw that. Maybe it's in my system. Yeah, okay.
No,
Mevit.
I think there is some latency.
Yeah, yeah. Anyways, I think we could just,
Uh,
hope for the best here
uh,
and then
uh,
move forward. Uh, all right, cool. So let's talk about, the other section, which is verbal. and then followed by DI. So maybe Prerit, it's this old stereotype that, yeah, I mean, Quant's piece of cake for a lot of people from STEM backgrounds, and verbals kind of like the main boogeyman or whatever it is they call it. So yeah, I mean, how did you deal with the boogeyman? How did you deal with verbal? And yeah, specifically, let's go from there.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with that stereotype because to me, verbal was definitely the hardest section early on. I mean, DI and quant are both mathematical in nature, so it's pretty easy to go about it. But for verbal, so first thing is that again, I mentioned the techniques to tackle paragraph questions, and I really suggest that you try all strategies with mock tests so that you could prepare yourself for the exam day. But also, one thing that I would advise is to improve your reading speed. So one thing that I got, one advice that I some level of technicality and good enough, level of English that if you frequently read it like every day, you would start to improve your vocabulary as well as your reading speed. Now, vocabulary isn't as much of an issue because there are difficult word in the paragraph. But so I would advise reading the Hindu article if you are struggling with another like time consuming thing. What you can simply do is just practice a lot of questions because a lot of the times you can just get an answer of the intuition. Like a lot of the times you can get to the root problem pretty easily, and it's just based on top of that. So, for example, like if it's not explicitly mentioned, even then, if you read the question, there would be a few keywords that would suggest to you, for example, this is based on of data insufficiency or something like that. And after a lot of practice, you can just get an idea of the base question that they want. And then you can just simply look at which option tackles that specific solution. So that helps you improve on the time for that question. Read a lot. So you
I think Prerit, you got frozen there. I think you froze for a few, at least on my screen. But nonetheless,
uh,
I think we did hear, maybe, yeah, maybe move locations or whatever. But yeah, I mean, let's go to Mevit meanwhile and talk about, your inputs or tips or strategies for cracking the quant section,
The verbal section.
the verbal section. My
Yeah,
apologies.
yeah. Yeah, I don't think I'll be particularly helpful there because I think the stereotype I've heard from my friends as well that verbal was difficult for some of them, but I personally didn't find it like that. Verbal came very intuitive to me. I always had a lot of time left on verbal sections. I think I used to read a lot, so the reading speed wasn't a constraint for me. Yeah, so I never had to tackle the time management issue involved at all. What I did focus on was that there are some questions that ask for like, what is the conclusion? What is the like? Is this the argument? Like they ask, I forgot the format in which they asked. I don't remember if they asked if whether this is an argument or find the argument or whatever. But at the end of the day, why that was kind of a curveball was that you had to get comfortable with what GMAT considers an argument, a conclusion, a preface. You might have a working understanding of it yourself, but might not match exactly, precisely with what they're saying. So I think that's the only part where I think the textbooks or watching some videos will really help you to understand what GMAT means by each of these sections, so that it gives you beyond just the intuitive feel, you know exactly what to look for when you look at the options. But yeah, I don't think I have a lot of input in terms of time management in the work section.
Okay, then let's go to DI in that case, Mevit, right? Let's talk about how you crack DI.
Yeah, so DI, yeah, I think, in fact, even when during the final exam, I think I had to solve the final question in the last 10 seconds. So DI can be a time constraint. So at least for me, that was my experience. And I think it was the fact that there were different formats, different categories of questions that would come. So like I said earlier, what I did was I spent the time to make sure that I was familiar with all of this. It's very intuitive about how the questions are being asked, so I don't waste time on the format figuring out how they are asking for it or anything. So just a bit of just a bit practice really helps there. And because there are some graphs involved, there are some diagrams involved sometimes. I don't think diagrams should have, like, yeah, there's usually a lot of graph work involved. So then also there's a lot of scope for getting mistaken, right? There might be two axes. There might be like uh, you might get the legend wrong. If you're looking for the triangles, you might be actually looking for the stars, whatever. So just whenever there's a graph involved, being very careful about the details, spending time to ensure that you got the whole picture correct is really helps in terms of accuracy.
Prerit, can you hear us?
Yeah. So to add on,
Yeah, please feel free to add on to what Mevit talked about.
Yeah.
I think there is a
right. So to simply because, pardon, did you say anything, sir?
Yeah, sorry, no, I think you're just freezing up on our frame, so that's why.
Internet connection is like I can rejoin in a minute.
Yeah, that's fine. That's okay.
Okay, I'll rejoin. Yeah.
All right. So while Prerit rejoins us, right, one quick thing I also wanted to share with you, and if you had a chance to go through the Ace the GMAT video, please do. I mean, there are a lot of practical strategies. I mean, we call them M7 strategies, really, to be able to ace the GMAT. So if you have not gone through it, please go through it. It's really, really effective. The one key thing that I wish to again reiterate specifically out of one of those M7 strategies is to just recognize that the GMAT is going to reward you for performance under pressure, under time pressure. A lot of your practice must be oriented towards the truth that you will encounter in the GMAT, which is what? Which is basically once you ascend in order of level of difficulty, you will stay there. That's what both Prerit as well as Mevit are talking about. That once you go to a particular level, right, in GMAT, you're going to be staying there. So what it basically means is you're going to be getting the harder level of questions based on your ability, of course, right? You're going to be getting top level hard questions in the exam, and you have to stay there and you have to get used to solving hard questions correct one after the other for a sustained period to crack the GMAT. That is the reality. And that is something that when people practice, oftentimes, and that's what we have covered in detail in the Ace the GMAT video, is people practice all type of questions. And when they actually go through the GMAT, the real GMAT, oftentimes they struggle in cracking the harder questions one after the other for a sustained period of time. So your practice actually must be oriented in such a way that you get used to solving the harder questions while still managing the time, right? And to me, when I'm kind of looking at and when I'm talking to a lot of people who have not done as well in the GMAT as they wanted to, this has often proved to be one of the key reasons, right? And the the reasons could, at least from the outside, come as, oh, you know what, I bombed a DI section, or I bombed a quant, or I bombed the verbal. But when you kind of probe and see, right, what you did well and how you did, oftentimes it is related with like not understanding or being the ability to solve harder questions in a sustained period of time is something that you really have to incorporate in your practice, and that is going to really be the determinant of your success. That's at least my point of view. I may be wrong, but that's what I feel. So Prerit, now we have you back. So maybe we can close out the DI section tips with you and then go from there. You're on mute, I think, Prerit. We can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, so hopefully my connection is better now, but to close on the DI section. So one thing that I was struggling with was just making silly mistakes in the section, simply because, again, there's a lot of technicalities in the questions and there's a lot of variety in them. And it's easy to skim past something and miss out on an important detail in what they're asking for. Like, for example, in the graph question, say they are asking for something and you don't take into account some other thing that they asked, like in the previous question, something like that. But so it's easy to make silly mistakes in the section. The only thing I would again recommend is practice. But practice in the DI section is quite hard simply because a lot of the questions are interactive in a sense. And what I personally did was I also purchased the Data Insights question bank on the official website to practice for the section, because it's not easy to come, at least also at my time. The Focus Edition had just come out with the Data Insights section being like completely brand new. So there weren't a lot of old resources to practice. But the question bank was really helpful because it had only high level questions, and doing them like continuously gave you a good idea of all the different types of questions that they asked for. And once you get enough practice, it's pretty easy again to recognize the pattern and then stop making those silly mistakes that you do. But otherwise, so again, reading the questions thoroughly is very important in this section, and that's why it can be a somewhat of a time crunch as well.
Okay, great. So what we'll do now quickly is to kind of discuss, your entire during exam sort of insights and behavior, because that's critical as well. So Mevit, we could probably start with you. I know that it's been a while, but try to go back a year or year plus, and try to put yourself back into the time when you were actually taking the test. And if you could go take us, like, maybe take a couple of minutes to take us through your entire experience, and how you adapted, if whatever things that you have to share with the audience to really help them sort of be in the right frame of mind, physically and mentally, to really ace the test.
Right. So of course, I think it depends a lot from person to person what they're the most comfortable with. But for me personally, being relaxed I generally try to be as relaxed as I can for any exam. I don't think, the time gives you enough pressure. You don't have to put additional pressure on yourself. Remembering the fact that it is an easy exam, the exam can't beat you. You just have to make sure you don't beat yourself. Is the mindset that I used to go with. And of course, in terms of slot, I took the afternoon slot because early morning waking up, I don't know how fast my brain will actually start clicking in the morning. So I just had a relaxed day, had a good lunch, then went for the exam and try to be as relaxed as possible. I know some people might perform better when there's additional pressure. If that's your thing, then I don't know how to go about that. But I just try to be as relaxed as I can, as comfortable as I can. And in the same, so even when taking the mock test, I used to be deliberate about that, being in the exam setting. I say that specifically because I had a friend, we used to practice a bit together, and she was very good when we were practicing cold questions, but during the exam she couldn't really perform well because the psychology kind of changes when you're actually taking the exam, right? So even when you're taking the mocks, you practice that. You don't let yourself take additional breaks or pause the exam or whatever. Be very deliberate. Be very try to recreate the same environment as you can during the mock, so that when you actually go for the test day, it'll be very similar, and you don't feel out of place.
As for me, so I tend to get stressed quite easily. So what I first of all did was I booked the GMAT like 2 or 3 days before I went to give it, rather than say a month or so ago, because then I would just be stressed about the deadline. And it's pretty easy to come by slots still if you just book it like quite close to the date. So that was one thing that helped me. Another thing that was important was the section order, because for me personally, again, Quant being easy, I took it as a sort of a break in my mind. Like, if I take Quant in between as the middle section, that would give me sort of time to rest between the two hard sections that are in the GMAT, and I could just relax and wind down, and then I could ramp up again. The third important thing was that they give you a 10-minute break in between the exam. Now, I would strongly advise that you don't try to stress about what you did in the previous sections that you like just did during that break. You just go ahead and like move around, like walk around a bit, wash your face. That's what I did. Like, I just didn't think about anything. I just washed my face. I had biscuits or something, but like just not think about the exam at all. And in fact, another strategy that was completely opposite to what Mevit did for me personally was I tried to envision the exam as like not an exam, but like just as a mock. So most of my mocks, I didn't do the thing that people usually recommend, where you do a proper setting, where you try to simulate the environment of the actual exam day and just focus on like not taking breaks or anything. I sort of did them, like I still did them under the time constraint, but I tried to be a bit more relaxed during the mocks itself. Like sometimes I maybe went ahead and walked off in the middle if I felt too like burnt up or stressed or something. And so I just tried to envision the exam as another mock that I'm just giving. And I didn't feel too much like I'm giving the actual exam. And just after each section, I was like, okay, I'll just relax a bit and wind down. It's just another section. And even during the break, I was just walking around and thinking about something else. And so the stress never really got to me in that sense then. Another thing is, again, like this exam, even if you fail, you can just give again in a few days. Like, so there's no real completely, like, there's not a very harsh penalty to failing. And that as a mindset is really helpful, because then you don't get too much stressed about the situation, because what's the worst that could happen? You can just give it again. And that's what you should keep in the mindset. Don't let that get to you, in the sense that you can just relax and don't take it seriously, but that you don't need to push yourself or like think of yourself as bad if you fail it, like in that sense that there's no strong repercussions to failing it, and with that you can keep yourself more relaxed.
I like to reiterate one point Prerit was saying, the not reflecting on the sections during the exam, because it's an adaptive test, right? So even if you're very confident you got 2 or 3 questions wrong, if there were very high difficulty questions and if you got a very lot of other high difficulty questions correct, you still might get 99 percentile. So for that particular section, so you really shouldn't worry about how a previous section went at all. Just look at it from a fresh perspective for every section is something I would very strongly recommend.
In fact,
one thing I wanted to have, I just wanted, sorry, Prerit, you wanted to say something, and then I can connect.
It's just one thing. Even so, I'm saying this from experience. In like in a few of my mocks actually, if you get just one question wrong, for example, and even in some cases two, you might still get a full score on the section. If they are, for example, in like the very last questions, for example, you still get a full score even if you get questions incorrect. So again, stressing about 1 or 2 questions might do more harm than good.
Yeah, so thank you so much for that. And I just wanted to have a quick check on what was the section order that you guys chose, and was there any thinking about it? Prerit already mentioned about him choosing the quant section in the middle to relax. Did you practice like that, Prerit, in your mocks as well, or was that like a on-the-spot decision, or did you think about it in advance?
So I thought about it in advance. It was always first, initially, I was trying to sort of keep it as it's make it quite similar to CAT, because I'd already given CAT. And within CAT, it's the section order is, I think, verbal, then DI, then quant. And in the initial few mocks that I tried, I did just that, but that wasn't working out quite well for me. Again, experimenting here is quite key, because section order does matter. I initially thought that it barely did, but it had significant impact on my performance. But so verbal DI quant wasn't working out. And then after that, I just kept quant in the middle at all times. And then I flipped around with verbal and DI in last and first places and see what worked out well for me. I think on the test day, it was DI, then quant, then verbal. But yeah, so keeping quant in the middle was really helpful for me personally.
For me, I spent a few months figuring out what I want to do, and what I ended up solving for was how fresh my brain was. So, like I said, for quant, my only concern was making silly mistakes. So I started off with quant, and the fatigue of the exam wasn't a factor. That I had a very fresh mind. I spent time to figure out if I'm making any dumb mistakes. So I would always take quant first, then build up the momentum, and then go for DI. I used to say verbal for last because verbal was very easy section for me. Even if I was tired from the exam, I was sure I could get it it would score very high on that. So I used to put verbal at the end in case, I get fatigued by the exam. But yeah, the tiredness of the exam is what I try to solve for. So that's why, because of my concern about mistakes, I used to put quant first and then DA, then verbal.
Yeah, so I mean, what I'm hearing, and this is something that we've kind of also covered in the Is the GMAT video, guys, is try to really experiment during your practice, right? figure out what is giving you consistently better results. And that is actually a thing. If you will really observe your own scores or mocks very carefully, just don't go with the flow. Try to be very aware of what order of sections and how your scores are getting churned out, right? You might actually see a trend that can actually benefit you in choosing that particular section. Again, both of them chose very different strategies of doing the sections, but again, they customized it to themselves. So, but just be aware that such a thing does matter, and that would really help. So I think that was the thing there. Mevit, did you talk about your in-exam experience already?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. All right. Great. So is there anything else you guys want to cover before we wind up today? Any kind of, say, resources, that you used and so on and so forth? Maybe we can close on that note and then, yeah.
So I found questions from the 700 to 800 club level question bank quite helpful because they were the hardest ones that you get, and those are really the ones you need to practice. The easier questions you are anyway is able to ace once you have a hang of the harder ones. So the 700 to 800 club ones, and then the Wiley's books on critical reasoning and the verbal were like the passages were also pretty helpful for verbal for me.
I think I didn't follow a lot of textbooks per se, even the official GMAT textbooks I just skimmed through. But some of the YouTube videos out there can be really helpful in terms of just making sure, in terms of strategy or in terms of some specific questions, what you should keep in mind. So I think, yeah, there were, I'm not sure if I should mention it on the call, but there are some very popular YouTube channels that have a series of different experts come in and talk about different sections. And I think some of them I found very useful in terms of ideating on how I should fix my strategy.
Yeah. So, I mean, for all of you guys, you can obviously get in touch with Mevit, and I'm sure he would be able to tell you, offline, what some of those channels potentially were. So, yeah, I mean, those are very, very helpful tips, guys. Thank you so much. So, yeah, I mean, I think we will I think we'll pause the recording now. So thank you so much, Mevit and Prerit, for being here. I think this was very illuminating, and a lot of your practice, your strategies that you shared with the group is definitely going to help us a lot in them being able to really go out and take the test very effectively. So thank you so much for your time. I really thank you for helping the cohort, and all the very best to both of you. And yeah, I wish you good luck, and thanks to all of you who attended. I hope this was useful as well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Sumit. All the best
Good
for
luck to all
everyone on
the
the call.
participants as well.
Yeah.